Last year, as part of our Dinner for Eight program, we were invited over to somebody's house for dinner. And they prepared for us a beautiful and delicious meal. And part of that meal was a bowl of fresh, ripe berries. And you know, there's something that's just so cool about a bowl of fresh, ripe berries. I mean, they seem so appetizing. They look beautiful and delicious. And so, you know, I saw these and I said, wow, these just look so good. And they said, well, would you like some? And I said, well, I actually don't like berries, but they look really good. And that's the thing that's kind of funny about ripe fruit, is that even if you don't like ripe fruit, it still looks really appetizing because we know that it is perfect, it is pretty, it is desirable, it is the way that it is supposed to be. Now contrast that with rotting fruit. And you see ripe fruit and you go, ooh, that looks so good. And you see rotting fruit and you kind of have exactly the opposite. We have a tendency to throw rotting fruit away because rotting fruit actually does more harm than good. It's interesting that rotting fruit gives off a gas. It gives off ethylene gas. And as rotting fruit goes through this process of rotting, it can actually make good fruit turn bad. Now, this is helpful if you've got stuff that's under-ripened. You know, you put two things in there together and they will help ripen each other. But the problem is that rotting fruit can help the good fruit go from being ripe to quickly going and rotting and speeding up that process along. Rotting fruit brings about more rotting fruit. This morning, we are looking at the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. And Paul uses an analogy based on rotting fruit to talk about our speech. Paul tells us that our speech is kind of like fruit, and that our speech can either build up other people and bring about very positive effects in people's lives, or our speech can be rotten and bring about rot and decay in the lives of other people. Paul's encouragement, quite obviously, is for us to be those who build up. So that's what we are turning our attention to this morning, is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, and I'd like to read that for you now. Here's what Paul says. It says, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building up others according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." So this is where we are putting our attention this morning. And as I mentioned, Paul uses this analogy of rotting fruit, and it's not really clear in English, but the Greek word that we translate to mean unwholesome here is actually a word that they used for rot and decay like you would find in fruit. And so basically what the Apostle Paul is saying is, do not let anything that would cause rot and decay in another person come out of your mouths. Do not allow yourself to cause rot and decay in somebody else. Now, first of all, hopefully all of us understand the power of words, because all of us at some point have surely experienced the sting of hurtful words. You know, the old children's rhyme is, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me," and we know that that is a lie. Many people carry around wounds for years based on some of the things that people have said. Sometimes people say things with the intention of trying to wound us, as though they are sending verbal darts directly towards our hearts. And I made a list of some of those kinds of things that sometimes we hear. Sometimes people may say something like, "You will never amount to anything." Or, "You know, you're just stupid." Or, "You're ugly," or "You're fat." "You are a disappointment." Or, "I have never loved you." Those kinds of statements are words that wound deeply. They cause wounds that we carry with us for years. And even as those wounds begin to heal, there are still scars that exist. We understand that words can have powerful impacts in our lives, and they can hurt us in ways that are very deep. But, you know, not all times that we are wounded by words are things where people are necessarily trying to be hurtful. Sometimes people are simply careless in their speech and say things that they don't mean to be hurtful, but without thinking they actually are. And I made another list of some of those kinds of things. Think about this. Somebody who says, why haven't you gotten married yet? And often people say this to somebody who they think is, should be married by this point. You're 22 years old. Why aren't you married yet? And the idea here is it's a way of trying to be complimentary, right? Well, you are just such a beautiful, wonderful person. Why hasn't somebody snagged you up yet? But hear what the person hears. There must be something wrong with you. And if they hear that over and over again, why is there something wrong with me? What is wrong with me? I should be married by now. And they are wounded by those words. Or how about this? You sure aren't like your brother or sister, are you? Some of you have heard that, haven't you? And again, it's not meant to be necessarily a wounding thing, but what you hear is, I am inadequate because I don't measure up to my brother or sister. Or maybe the person says, well, I guess you're not as smart as I thought you were. Again, probably intended to be a compliment of saying, you're a really smart person and normally you have the answers and this time I guess you didn't. But what do you hear? You are a disappointment to me. You haven't lived up to the hype that I had for you. There's lots of ways that we can be wounded by words. Some are simply insensitive, some are intentional, some are unintentional. Sometimes we just don't think about it. Paul tells us is that we should not be people who are wounding others with our words. And so how do we avoid this? Well, Martin Lloyd-Jones, a preacher from a while back, came up with three different categories or three different characteristics that are common of unwholesome talk. And I think he hits this pretty good, and so I want to go down these lists. First is that unwholesome talk flows out of excessive speech. Unwholesome talk often results from us talking on and on and on. Think about it. We can talk a whole bunch and not really say anything. Isn't that true? That we can talk and talk and talk, but not actually say anything. And this makes sense. The book of Proverbs talks about this. Proverbs 10:19 says, when words are many, sin is not absent. So many times we get to talking, and we talk as kind of a way of filling the silence while we think about what we're going to say, which you understand kind of makes no sense, right? Because we're just talking, and we're thinking about something entirely different. Well, what happens is that sometimes we can be insensitive. Sometimes we can say things that we don't really mean to say while we are blathering on and on. And so when our words are many, often sin is not absent, and we can engage in unwholesome talk. So that's the first thing. The second characteristic of unwholesome talk is that it is self-serving. Now, certainly, sometimes we do have to talk about ourselves. It's important. We need to communicate about what we are feeling and what we need and what we think. Those things are important. The problem is that when the pattern of all of our speech centers on us and about bringing everything to center on us, we have a real problem there. Probably you have been around people, or maybe you are a people, who has a tendency to bring conversations back to yourself. You always want to interject and correct people because it makes you look smart, doesn't it? When we correct other people and jump in and say, that's not really right. It's a way of us trying to make ourselves look smarter. We want to jump in and tell a story about, the time that I went through that, and here's how I handled it. We are doing those things as a way of building ourselves up. People who engage in self-serving talk are often people who are interrupters. You know that, right? That we have somebody will be talking and you just interject. You jump in. Sometimes it's to correct somebody. Sometimes it's to change the subject or to change the story. You interrupt as a way of gaining control so that we can bring back the conversation to our most important and most favorite subject, me. And that's the way that we sometimes result, and that is self-serving talk. But it's not just interrupting that can result in self-serving talk. We can engage in unwholesome, self-serving talk by not listening as well. Husbands, pay attention for a second. When somebody is talking to you and you are not paying attention to what they are saying, you are engaging in unwholesome talk. I'm speaking to myself as we do this too. Yes, dear. What did I just say? I don't know. That's unwholesome talk, okay? Because it is self-serving. What is being said is, I am more important than you. What I am doing is more important than what you have to say. That's self-serving talk. even though we are not actually speaking, because we are sending messages to other people. So that's the second one, is that unwholesome talk is self-serving. Third, unwholesome talk is indelicate. It is indelicate. And what this means is that unwholesome talk that is indelicate doesn't worry about how other people will hear what it is that we are saying. Indelicate speech doesn't worry about how what we say might impact those around us. And there are lots of ways that we can engage in this kind of indelicate talk. One is to just be harsh with people. Think about it for a moment. Suppose that you are working on a project and you are really trying to concentrate. It requires great concentration from you. And in whatever room you are working on this, there is somebody who you find to be a distraction. They're talking or they're making noise or something. And so you have a couple of options of how to respond to that person. One is to yell at them, "Shut up, will you?" That's one way. Not necessarily the way I'm advocating, but it is one way that probably is effective in making them quiet. That way is not concerned about the other person. It is harsh. It is not concerned about how they might feel in the way that we talk to them. It is concerned about getting the results that we desire. Another approach might be to say something like, "Hey, you probably don't realize this, but I'm really trying to concentrate on something, and I'm finding it difficult to do so right now. Could you try and bring the volume level down for just a little bit, because it'd make it a whole lot easier for me to concentrate." See the difference between those two approaches? Both are communicating the same desire, which is I desire you to be quiet so I can concentrate, but one is actually concerned about how the other person might hear what we have to say. One is indelicate and unwholesome. The other is concerned about others. Now, we can also be unwholesome and indelicate when we engage in speech that is vulgar, obscene, offensive. Any of those kinds of or categories of speech are also unwholesome talk, because what we are saying is, I really don't care whether you find this talk offensive. I'm going to talk the way that I want. There's lots of ways that we can engage in indelicate speech. And truthfully, the whole umbrella of unwholesome talk is pretty wide. And we find that there are all sorts of things that fit under there, and we have a great deal of experience with them. Again, I made a list of some of the ways in which we can engage in unwholesome talk. We can engage in unwholesome talk by swearing or taking the Lord's name in vain. We can engage in unwholesome talk by gossiping about others, or by using biting or painful sarcasm. We can engage in unwholesome talk by making a joke at the expense of another person. It's unwholesome to engage in coarse or sexual joking. We can engage in unwholesome talk when we speak violently to other people, or when we just don't take into account how other people might feel about what we say. There are a lot of ways that we can be unwholesome in our speech. The challenge is for us to pay attention to our speech, and as Paul says, to rid those things from our mouths. That kind of talk should not come out of the mouth of a Christian. That's what Paul says. But he doesn't end there. He continues on. In the second half of verse 29, he said, "Don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths." And then he goes on and he says, "But say only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." Basically, what Paul is saying is he's going beyond. He says it's not just enough to not say bad things. It's not just enough for us to clean up our speech. The difference is that we need to actually be concerned about the impact that our speech is having on other people. I came across a quote from a pastor by the name of John Piper, and he sums this up pretty well, and so I want to read you his quote here. He says, "The issue is not whether our mouth can avoid gross language. The issue is whether our mouth is a means of grace." You see, he shifts from the external fruit to the internal root. He shifts from what we say to why we say it. That is the issue. Paul's concern isn't just that we stop saying bad things. His concern is that we use our speech as a way of actually benefiting other people. Our concern should be to communicate in a way that other people are built up when they hear what we have to say. Now, that sounds great, and we say, I want to do that, but I don't know how. Well, I'll be honest with you. I don't have this all figured out either. But here's some suggestions of some things that I think we can do as a way of going about trying to help other people with our speech as opposed to simply being concerned with ourselves. And I think the answer is that it starts in our hearts. Over in the book of Matthew, chapter 12, verses 33 and 34, Jesus was speaking to the religious leaders of the day, and this is what he says. He says, "Make a tree good, and its fruit will be good. Or make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks." You see what Jesus is saying there? He says, what comes out of our mouths is a reflection of what is in our hearts. Kind of a scary thought, isn't it? That the things that come out of our mouths are simply an overflow of what actually resides within our hearts. So we have to start by changing our hearts and changing our pattern and changing the way that we think in order to begin helping other people with our words. And so here's some suggestions on how we do that. First, surround yourself with good influences. We tell kids this all the time, right? You need to be careful in hanging out with who you hang out with. Be careful in who you choose to be your friends because they can rub off on you and they can have either a positive or a negative influence on you. We say that to kids all the time, but we have a tendency to feel like we don't really need to take that advice anymore. But we go, I can handle it because I'm a grown-up. I can handle being around this stuff now. Really? What happens? Whatever we surround ourselves with is what we become like. And so if we choose to spend time with people who are constantly swearing and taking the Lord's name in vain, if we choose to be around people who are gossips, if we choose to be around people who are constantly tearing down others with our words, what do you think is eventually going to happen to us? We will start by beginning to think that way, and then slowly but surely we will begin to talk that way. Or maybe you don't hang around those people, but we watch TV shows or movies or read books or websites or listen to music that does those kinds of things. So we need to be careful. If we want to become like people who are encouragers, people who have wholesome, uplifting talk, then what do we need to do? We need to surround ourselves with those kinds of people. Read Christian books, listen to Christian radio, spend time with people who embody this kind of speech. Reflect on Scripture. Allow it to penetrate your heart, because what happens is we become like those we allow to influence us. And so we need to choose our influences carefully. Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, I believe, gives very good insight into this as well. Paul tells us, again, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. It's good advice. If we want to be people who engage in uplifting talk, we need to surround ourselves with those kinds of influences. So that's the first thing, surround ourselves with good influence. The second piece of advice I would give you is to begin to listen to what you say. Listen to yourself. Maybe some of you have had the experience that I have had, where you are sitting at home, minding your own business, having a normal day, and then your children say something and you immediately have the desire to scold them for what they're saying, until you realize that they are simply parroting what they have heard you say. Had that happen recently, and my child said something, and I went, "Oh, you learned that from me, didn't you?" Our children sometimes act as a mirror to us because we don't actually pay attention to what we say or the way that we say it. We shouldn't need our kids to reflect our speech patterns back to us because we should be people who are reflecting on our speech patterns on our own. We need to ask ourselves, why am I saying what I am saying? What is my motivation? Am I trying to build myself up? Am I trying to tear someone else down? Why am I saying what I am saying? I think it starts, the way that we begin to change is to be aware of the problems that we have within us. Ask yourself, what is my heart motivation? Remember that what comes out of our mouths is an overflow of what is in our hearts, and so our speech is reflective of what is in our hearts and the internal problem that is there. So we need to listen to what we say. Third, we need to listen to others. Now, before you misunderstand me, I'm not saying listen to all the ways that other people break these commandments and then go, look, I'm better than they are. That is not what I am saying, okay? What I am saying is that we need to listen to the way that other people respond to our speech. Think about this. You say something and somebody snaps angrily back at you. We need to ask ourselves, why did they respond in that way? Did I say something that hurt them? What did I do that caused injury to them, that caused them to respond that way? And we need to be better at listening not just with our ears, but listening with our eyes and with our hearts. Pay attention to the nonverbal communication that other people offer to you as you are speaking to them. Watch for the person who you say something to them and suddenly you kind of see them wince. It's a subtle movement, isn't it? But that tells us that what you said hurt them. Or you begin talking to somebody and you're talking to them about something, maybe you're trying to make a joke and all of a sudden you kind of see them look away from you and not make eye contact anymore. What does that tell us? It says, I'm ashamed by what you have just said. Or the person who you say something and you can tell that it tears them down because you see their shoulders kind of slump and it's almost as though the air has been let out of them. Similarly, the opposite side of that is you say something that builds somebody up and you watch the shoulders become straighter, they stand up a little stronger. You can tell when you've been talking for too long. This is a skill that I have to learn. You can tell when you've been talking for too long because people stop paying attention to you. They kind of look away. They begin fiddling with other things. Those kinds of things are all nonverbal cues that tell us about what our speech is doing to another person. We can learn about our speech by watching the way that other people respond. Again, the goal of what we are doing is to build up other people, and if we want to know what effect our words are having, we need to watch other people. Learn to see the way that other people view your speech. We may have an idea in our head of what we think, but the truth is that sometimes we don't realize it. The person who has been told that they are dumb all their lives is going to be very sensitive to statements, and we may not even realize that we are hurting them. They're telling a story about something that they did that was kind of foolish, and you go, you dummy. We wouldn't realize that we're trying to hurt them unless we watch their face and we see the pain that comes across them. Watching other people, learning to listen with our eyes and our ears will help us to be aware of our speech. Fourth, we need to think about our thoughts. And I realize that sounds confusing. So what does it mean to think about your thoughts? Well, think about it this way. Every word that we say starts as a thought that we think. Everything that comes out of our mouths starts in our heads. Every word starts as a thought. And so what we need to do is, Paul tells us elsewhere, he says, take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. In other words, we need to think about what is actually going on in our heads, and before we allow those thoughts to just come out of our mouths without paying any attention to them, we need to think about them and then be careful about them. We need to take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Think about the thoughts that are running through your head and say, is this something that would build up somebody else, or is it something that would tear them down. We can choose to give life to positive thoughts, and we can choose to suppress and ignore those negative thoughts. I was reading an article by a guy by the name of Craig Groeschel, and in his book, Soul Detox, he gives really good advice in this regard, I think. He said, here's the advice that I try to live by. When I think of something positive about somebody, I say it. And I went, wow, what a novel idea. When we think something positive about somebody, say it. Similarly, when we think something negative, we can just choose to not say that. We actually do have that option, by the way. But what we can do, think something positive, express it to the person that you think it about. You see your wife walk in the room and you say, wow, you just really look nice. It's okay to say that. Or, this seems silly, but I really appreciate that you did this for me. We can say these things that are simple things that build other people up. And you say, well, that's just awkward for me to do. So what? Don't we want to change? We live in a connected society. This is really easy to do. You say, well, I don't know the next time I'll see that person. So? We talk to people all the time without actually seeing them. Yeah, the ideal way is to say these kinds of positive things in person. But, you can send a letter, you can send an email, you can send a text message, you can call them on the phone, you can send a Facebook message. The list goes on and on and on. When you think something positive about another person, express that thought. What happens when we do that? We will begin to give life to our positive thoughts. We will begin to dwell on our positive thoughts. And over time, the attitude of our hearts will change from being people who are negative and rotten to people who are positive and nourishing. Fifth, enlist the help of a trusted friend. It is really hard to change our speech patterns. Often it's even hard for us to be aware of what we are saying because it's just the way that we talk. I challenge you to get somebody close to you, somebody who knows you well, somebody who has your best interests at heart, and give them permission to shoot straight with you. Ask them, I want you to help me to change the way that I talk. When you see that I'm saying something that is rotten, something that's tearing down somebody else, would you tell me? Because I want to be changing that. You'd be amazed that probably our friends and our family are much more aware of the way that we talk than we are. And because they're more aware of the way that we talk, they're more aware of what is in our hearts than we are. We can use our friends to reflect back to us our patterns of speech, and we can see it for what it really is. And a trusted friend can go a long way to help us to begin to see ourselves. I hope you understand the power that our words have. Our words can build people up or they can tear them down. We can be people who engage in rotten talk, or we can begin to weed that out and say, I'm going to use my words to nourish other people. And you say, this is a really daunting task. How do I change the way that I talk all the time? I can't possibly gain control over every area of my life. Well, first of all, I think that's a lie. But second of all, you're right. It is hard to do that all at once. Here's where I think we start. Start at home. Start with the people that you care about the most. Because, let's face it, the people that we are most unguarded with are the people who we care about the most. And so if we really care about them, we should be wanting to control our speech and be beneficial to them, right? Start at home. Think about the way that you talk to your spouse, to your children, to your parents, to your siblings. Start there. Because here's what I really think. If we can be people who are uplifting with those with whom we are most comfortable, that's going to begin overflowing into every other area of our lives. If we can talk gently and lovingly and respectfully to those in our own households, we will do the same to complete strangers, won't we? We can be people. We are commanded to be people who engage in uplifting talk. We are commanded to be people who are different from the pattern of the world. And yes, it's hard. But we can go from being rotten to being nourishing. We can go from tearing people down with our words to building them up. We can go from being discouraging to being encouraging. And what effect would that have if we were to be like that? If everyone in all of our churches began to be people who engaged only in fruitful talk, what would that look like? Wouldn't our churches have a different feel to them? Wouldn't people not say, I don't like to go to that church because I feel judged when I walk in there? No, people would walk into our churches and they say, I love coming here because I feel like people really care about me. What would people be like if they had conversations with Christians who really talked this way? They would come away and say, I love talking to Christian people because every time I talk to them, I just feel better after having done so. It's just an uplifting experience to talk with somebody who really cares and is concerned about me. And don't you think that if we were to talk in this way, people would come away from every conversation that we have had and say, I understand the love of Jesus Christ because I see it in the way they talk. It's a daunting task. It's hard for us to change the way that we talk. But when we think about what it can lead to and what God plans to do through our speech, I think it is well worth the effort. Will you pray with me? Father, this is really hard for us to think about. We don't like to think that we may be people who engage in rotten talk, but if we are honest, every one of us does. Lord, forgive us. Help us to see ourselves accurately. Help us to hear what we say and the heart with which it is said. Lord, we want to reflect your love. We want to care for other people more than just as what they can give to us. But it is a struggle for us to make that transition. We can't do it on our own. We need your help. We need each other's help. So, Father, bind us together. Give us the strength to begin making changes in our lives. We know it'll be a slow process, but help us to see progress. Help us to help each other. And help us to be people who offer life-nourishing words to everyone around us. For we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.